Hey class, welcome back. And we are going to get into chapter 8 today, which is titled Anti-Railroad, Municipal Graft, and Labor Struggles. This is really the last chapter where we will be spending in the 19th century. And next we will be moving into 20th century California history, talking about the Progressive Era. This is also the last chapter covered for exam number 3. So here are the key terms for today. We're going to talk about the Battle of Mussel Slough, Ellen Colton versus Leland Stanford, the Union Labor Party of San Francisco, labor strikes, and Phineas Banning, and finally the San Francisco earthquake of 1906. So we're going to begin with the Battle of Mussel Slough, also known as the Mussel Slough tragedy. This takes place in 1880, and it was really the culmination of more than a decade of tension between squatters and homesteaders and the railroad company, the Southern Pacific Railroad. The Southern Pacific Railroad had received a massive land grant in the Central Valley. And over the course of them owning that land, various homesteaders and squatters had come into that region and basically developed a homestead there. And they eventually wanted to buy that land. Now, they wanted to buy that land at the rate that the government typically sold land for, which was $2.50 an acre. They thought that this was fair considering the fact that the Southern Pacific Railroad had actually gotten the land from the government. And so they insisted on paying that price. The railroad, on the other hand, wanted to sell the land for $10 to $25 an acre, depending upon how close to development it was and access to water, etc. And there was a court case over this, and the court will side with the railroad company. And ultimately, this will lead to some forced evictions of some of the squatters living on this land. And that's when this big violent confrontation erupts. When it was all said and done, 6 men will lie dead. And even though it was not really one side's fault or the other, the railroad company was in many ways just as much to blame as the squatters were in this particular instance. The railroad company will come out looking like the bad guy. And this is really the beginning of the end for the power and prestige of the Southern Pacific Railroad. And we can really see this reflected in this political cartoon. Up in the upper left-hand corner of this cartoon, you see the victims of the Mussel Slough tragedy. And then you see Justice, who is basically, pointing their finger. She's pointing her finger at the big four, the railroad monopolies. And this is a cartoon drawn by George Keller, who worked for a satirical magazine called The Wasp. And basically, what he's saying here in this cartoon is that all of the growing anti railroad sentiment that was brewing in California at the time was a direct result of the Mussel Slough tragedy, and that the ghosts of the Mussel Slough victims were somehow driving this force of ruin for the railroad. And this cartoon is dated October of 1882. So this is just 2 years after the Mussel Slough battle. Okay, to add to the hate towards the Southern Pacific Railroad, there was a very publicized lawsuit headed up by Ellen Colton, who was the widow of David Colton. He was the primary lobbyist for the Southern Pacific Railroad in San Francisco, which means that he spent a lot, excuse me, not San Francisco, Sacramento. He spent a lot of time in Sacramento at the state capitol trying to get laws passed that were favorable to the railroad company and also bribing politicians and things like that. So he held a large share in the Southern Pacific Railroad. And when he died, his widow gets a little over $500,000. However, earlier that year, Mark Hopkins, who was one of the Big Four, original Big Four, had also died, and his shares, it turns out, Mrs. Colton finds out, were valued at a much higher rate than her husband's shares. So she decides that she is going to sue the railroad, Leland Stanford and the railroad, for $4 million, which is what she estimates her husband's shares were worth. The main thing about this lawsuit is that she makes public all of these letters that were printed between her husband and Huntington, Hollis Huntington. And in these letters, it becomes very clear that the railroad company is involved in a lot of political corruption. There's talk in these letters of bribes, etc., and it's very incriminating against the railroad. And the San Francisco Chronicle and the New York World, they actually printed these letters in the newspaper for the public to see. So it becomes this huge embarrassment to the railroads, where it becomes very obvious that the Southern Pacific was engaged in paying off politicians, in paying off judges. And ultimately, Mrs. Colton is going to lose her lawsuit. But this particular lawsuit, and the fact that these letters were publicized in the newspaper, will further the tarnish on the reputation of the Southern Pacific Railroad. Okay, so we're now going to turn our attention to looking at San Francisco politics as we get into the 20th century. And we're going to talk about the Labor Union Party of San Francisco. The Labor Union Party was founded in 1901 by a group of union leaders after a big dock strike at the San Francisco docks. And we're going to talk more about sailors and some of their issues on the next slide. But what made the Labor Union Party unique is its platform. It supported not just workers' rights, but it also supported government ownership of public utilities. This was something that was common in other countries like Australia or England. They had labor union parties, but it was very uncommon in the United States to find this type of party platform. And so this labor union party appealed to working class people. And by the time we get to 1901 in San Francisco, there is a very large population of working class people. So in 1901, an up and coming politician by the name of Abraham Roof decided that he would recruit his friend Eugene Schmitz to take control of this labor union party and run as the mayoral candidate in the 1901 election. Eugene Schmitz will win the election and become the next mayor of San Francisco and be reelected 2 more times. This will usher in a whole new political environment in San Francisco, one that was really filled with corruption because Roof and Schmitz ran a political machine style government, meaning that there were a lot of kickbacks, there was a lot of payoffs, there was a lot of bribes. And what you see here in this photograph is a picture of Abraham Roof, who you see pictured sort of in the very, here, I'll put on my laser pointer here. So this is Abraham Roof right here in the center, and this is Eugene Schmitz right here. And then the people that you see around them, these are all part of the San Francisco City Board of Supervisors. They are the ones that are basically passing city policy and things, and they were all bought off by Schmitz and Roof. Roof actually is not a politician here. He acts as the labor union party lawyer. So he is able to kind of navigate this party through various legal loopholes. So it becomes known, this labor union party, as a very corrupt political machine. However, it should be noted that because there was a labor union party in charge of San Francisco at the beginning of the 20th century, San Francisco does gain a reputation as being the best city in the country, where workers would enjoy higher pay than other places and better working conditions. So let's now move on to talk about some of the issues when it comes to labor in San Francisco. What were these labor unions fighting for, and why? How did they organize? So we're going to begin by talking about the 1891 Sailors Union of the Pacific. This is the ultimate labor union for sailors that was formed after many different incarnations of organization by laborers. Beginning with the Coast Seamen's Union, and later on being countered by the Ship Owners Association, and ultimately, as I said, really forming into this Sailors Union of the Pacific. The Sailors Union of Pacific was headquartered in San Francisco, and it was headed up by Andrew Forsyth, and he saw to it that the union joined the city's powerful Federated Trades Council in an alliance of labor organizations. And this is one of the reasons why they were so successful, is they joined with the San Francisco Labor Council, which allowed for them to be able to have a lot more power as a union. The Sailors Union of the Pacific will open up offices all over the Pacific, including Seattle, Honolulu, and even over in the Atlantic in Norfolk, Virginia. They eventually will be the driving force behind passing the La Follette Seamen's Act of 1915, which ended imprisonment for desertion and mandated better working conditions for sailors. This was very important because one of the things that was very common for sailors, and one of the reasons why sailors protested their working conditions so frequently, is that sailors were often um, the victims of something called shanghaied. And this is where sailors would be drugged or knocked out. And this would typically be done in boarding houses or bars that were adjacent to boarding houses. And that this is where the sailors would be recruited to go onto boats. So these crib owners, as they were called, which are basically boarding house owners, would conspire with the ship owners to Shanghai certain sailors onto their vessels. So the way that it would work is a sailor would be drugged or knocked out and then brought aboard the vessel. And then by the time they came to consciousness, they would be out at sea. Now, that was a major problem for that sailor, because now that sailor was under the command of that captain of the ship, but also there could be severe punishments for deserting that ship. So let's say you got shanghaied in San Francisco and you pulled into port in Honolulu, Hawaii, and you wanted to escape. It would be very difficult for you to do that because there would be severe legal consequences for you deserting that ship. So the La Follette Seamen's Act then made it so that you would not be imprisoned for deserting your ship under those circumstances. So that was a big win for sailors. In 1892, the San Francisco Labor Council is founded, and this was a council that was focused on organizing factory workers. And again, this was the culmination of many different other incarnations of labor union movements prior to that, like the San Francisco Trades Assembly and the Federated Trades Council. All of these kind of consolidate their efforts into the San Francisco Labor Council of 1892. And again, they're focusing on workers who are working in factories. And then you also get women who are getting involved in these labor movements. Women who were working as waitresses, women who were working as laundry workers, women who were working in factories across the city. And ultimately, these striking workers, particularly in San Francisco, will lead to some very progressive legislation that's going to be passed in the 19 teens to protect women, including a minimum wage for women, which was passed in 1911 by the California State Legislature, and the 8-hour workday for women, which was passed in 1913, also by the California State Legislature. Now, one of the sort of darker parts of these labor union movements is that they were overwhelmingly anti-Chinese. Chinese workers were discriminated against, they were left out of union movements, and they were also targeted as the scapegoats for the reasons why, in times of economic downturn, white workers could not get employment. So, these labor unions oftentimes supported the restrictive legislation against the Chinese, including the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. In response to a lot of this labor activity, Los Angeles decides to embrace something called the open shop movement. Theoretically, open shop businesses were those that had hired irrespective of whether a job seeker was a union member or not. However, in practice, what that meant was that if you were a union member, you would not be allowed to get a job. And so basically, open shop was a code word for anti union. The person that headed up this anti-union movement in Los Angeles was a man by the name of Otis Gray. He was also owned the Los Angeles Times and was a big part of the Merchant and Manufacturers Association. And they will be responsible for passing anti-union legislation in the city. And this will eventually lead to a retaliation against the Los Angeles Times. On October 1st of 1910, the LA Times building will explode suddenly, and 20 men will die and 17 more will be injured. Labor union leaders will be held responsible for this, and ultimately there will be a major backlash against union activity in Los Angeles. And so Los Angeles, compared to San Francisco, will really remain behind the times in terms of unionization. And as I said, lots of anti-union laws and suppression of unions will take place in Los Angeles, where on the other hand, San Francisco becomes known as a city that was friendly towards unions. So here you see some images. The image on the left, this is a sailor who has been shanghaied. You see that he looks as if he is unconscious, and he is basically being hoisted up onto a ship where he will supposedly be set out to sea, and wake up and find out that he has now been shanghaied. The La Follette Seamen's Act will help protect shanghaied sailors after 1911. On the right-hand side, you see a couple of striking female workers. These workers are striking for tailors, but again, women become really instrumental in this early labor union movement because women did make up a large percentage of the workforce, and even more of a percentage of the workforce in California, where California was known to have women that were very independently minded. Okay, so now we're going to focus on one of the entrepreneurs of Southern California, somebody who came to California and really made its mark, especially on the maritime development of the state, a man by the name of Phineas Banning. Born in Wilmington, Delaware, he came to California when he was just 21 years old via the Panamanian route and ended up in San Pedro in 1851. So he was one of the early arrivers to California. And he built a stagecoach line from Banning, California to San Pedro. And he built up a little fortune by running these stagecoaches back and forth between Banning and San Pedro. And he soon recognizes the importance of building a major port in Los Angeles and was instrumental in creating the port of San Pedro. In fact, he went through a huge a battle between the Southern Pacific Railroad and Huntington and his idea for building the port at San Pedro. Eventually, Banning will win, and he will win the federal funds to build the port at San Pedro, which will become the port of Los Angeles. He founds the town around the port and he names it Wilmington after his hometown of Wilmington, Delaware. The other thing that Phineas Banning is known for is for envisioning Catalina Island as a tourist destination. His sons will end up buying most of the island and developing it into a tourist destination. And eventually they end up selling it to the Wrigley family of Wrigley Gum. But they are really the first ones, the first visionaries to see Catalina as a tourist destination. So let's look at some photos. So here we see some photographs of Catalina Island, early photographs. So the Banning brothers, the sons of Phineas, bought the island in 1891. They established the Santa Catalina Island Company and began to develop it into a resort destination. So you see here a really old photograph of Avalon. You see here a picture of the Banning family. Eventually, they will have to sell the island. They'll sell it in 1919. But over the couple of decades, several decades that they did develop the island, they established some of its iconic areas like Avalon Beach, Lover's Cove, Descanos Beach, Sugarloaf Point, and the future site of the Catalina Casino. They also built the pier, which stands to this day in Avalon Bay. Okay, so now we're going to turn to talking about the San Francisco earthquake, which occurred April 18th, 1906, in the early morning hours. The epicenter of the earthquake was about 2 miles west of San Francisco on the ocean floor, and it was felt all throughout the state, as far south as Los Angeles and as far north as Coos Bay, Oregon. The earthquake is estimated to be somewhere around 7.9 to 8.0 on the Richter scale. At the time that the earthquake occurred, there was a reported 700 dead, but modern researchers put that death toll at more like 3,000. Most of the destruction from this particular earthquake occurred as a result of fires that were lit from leaking gas pipes, and there were as many as 50 separate fires throughout the city, which over the course of several days will basically level the city to the ground. Um, The San Francisco earthquake is significant in many ways for the history of San Francisco. And it marks the political end of the graft and the corruption of the Union Labor Party, because in the wake of the San Francisco earthquake, the Union Labor Party leaders will be put on trial for graft and bribery. Um, and um, and so there's a political transition, but also there's a reawakening of the city as the city is rebuilt in the wake of the San Francisco earthquake. It sort of is redefining what it is. It transforms from this gold rush era city, this kind of roughneck time period, to becoming a modern city. And we can see that really celebrated in uh, the Pan Pacific Expo that's going to take place in the city in 1913, that really celebrates sort of the rebuilding or the reawakening of the San Francisco earthquake. And so the San Francisco earthquake, a huge event in the city's history. I recommend clicking onto these links to learn more about it and to see some of the destruction that was caused by this seminal event in San Francisco's history. So that will conclude chapter 8 and also the material for exam number 3. Please email me if you have any questions, or tune into Zoom office hours or the Zoom review session this Wednesday at 12:30. All right, have a good one, guys. Bye.